Jo Wilson's Courtship by Henry Lawson is one of the 4 short stories that are studied in the high school certificate in the module Distinctively Visual. The story begins with a flashback where Jo Wilson conversationally shares with the responder the typical experience of an Australian boy at the turn of the 20th century in rural Australia. Jo, in a very conversational tone, uses imagery and dialogue in his flashback to recall the practical skills visually for the responder that are required in making an effective bushman. The imagery of mateship and of friendship and of freedom that is actually included in this very brief but detailed opening are a sequence of universal events that lead to healthy, happy boyhood. A kaleidoscope of anecdotes that depict a rejection of formality are clearly established through the use of dialogue, creating a likeable, independent boy in the mind of the responder. These active and animated boys are not isolated or separated by formality, especially when swimming naked and not going to school with their friends in the sandy creek. The comment that it's natural in a climate like Australia is in part to contrast the rigid formality of English culture, which was quite predominant or dominant at the time. When his father buys him a gun, when he gets a horse, saddle, bridle of his own. The pronouns in these anecdotes emphasise the independence and confidence of the Australian boy. He's proud then, the proudest boy in the district. The universality of Jo's narration in terms of boyhood creates a typical childhood for all the male characters, his stock characters, in all 4 of his stories, but in particular the people you're going to meet at So Long and at Havland, the station. Now, while boyhood may be happy, the happiest of times and the wisdom that Jo wishes to share with the responder are the courting days, and in that they're the happiest time in a man's life. Jo emphasises purity, so he gives us insight into the values of the time in that, relationships between men and women in terms of a sexual nature were kept after marriage. And he also makes very clear that there's little opportunity for poetry and beauty in a bushman's life, and that this is one instance where it will take place, so that courting is important in that sense. Lawson also points out through Jo's narration that the lives of the early settlers and pioneers were very difficult, and so that these courting days will be something delightful and bright that the young wife will look back on, or the older wife will look back on, in really difficult times. Jo, the older married man, speaks directly to younger men here who are courting, and makes evident that with intimacy comes insight, using the phrase that he can see the woman's world through the eyes of his wife. Jo goes on to say that such insight gives the married man an understanding of the great difficulties that women face in bush life. He does this using the illusion of Mark Twain and the pilot's eye in the river. The comparison being made here is not that a woman's beauty is lost, but that the bushman really understands the great difficulties and dangers faced by women in isolated and rural communities. So Joe, having shared his wisdom on the importance of courtship and how happiness is defined at this particular time for Australian men, begins a flashback of his courtship of Mary. The setting is Havland Station, which is not particularly a long way from Solong, a small town, a little town, where Jack is settled with his wife. This is not the harsh outback of the drover's wife or in a dry season, but a more fertile area with greater rainfall. So through Joe's narration, the two friends, Joe Wilson and Jack Barnes, are visually depicted as rural workers, using vernacular language and idiomatic dialogue. The two men have been drovers. They've both done a bit of fencing. Both had worked as shearers in rather large sheds like at big scrubs. So the vernacular language establishes visually the lives of Jack and Joe before Solong. We're introduced to Havland, the station, and Mr. Black, the squatter. The formality of the time is evident in the references to boss or Mr. Black, but both Jack and Joe are ambivalent about the wealth of Black. He's seen and is depicted as a squatter of the old school who had shared early hardships with his men, and that he was a man who didn't sort of keep himself separate so that he couldn't see why he shouldn't shake hands and have a smoke or yarn over old times. So there's a strong sense of mateship, while also a strong sense of respect for those who are self-made men. The irony, of course, is that Black wasn't a self-made man. His wife had had money. But the two men still accept him because of his egalitarian way of interacting with them and other itinerant men that worked on the station. Lawson visually depicts the nation building and the wealth held in the rural districts of that time, and goes to quite considerable detail in terms of describing Havland, with the older home in the background and the homestead, the more established homestead, in front, as is depicted in this watercolour. The description of the house at Havland is quite detailed, and it's also here where we get a vignette where Mary comes trotting out, and so it was in the frame of vines that I first saw her. The symbolism of the vines representing faithfulness and Mary's plumpness, so representing fertility, is in stark contrast to the drover's wife. Now, of course, Mary was in service, so she was a maid on the station. And here we have a rather lovely image of a maid. Now, so she's called two names, Miss Mary Brand, and you'll notice the formality again, which gives us insight into the values at the time, and that until someone was married or part of the family, that people were actually used formal salutations. Both of these quotes are vignettes. They're quite romantic. They have the idea of a frame which visually sort of represents a picture in his mind, and very much like the picture that you might have of a loved one or a photograph. Now, of course, Joe is a nervous young man, but he's rather comfortable that he was actually on horseback, because most bushmen look better on a horseback, as does this young bushman here from out west. Joe's narration about Mary gives us great insight into the values of the time. Both these quotes demonstrate the importance of social status and racial background. Lawson uses cooler, gentler climates to define the type of complexion that he wishes for in a wife. And he makes those Joes. In terms of social circumstance, English heritage was still valued, was greatly valued, in the sense that there would be gentler manners, and the fact that Mary was somehow connected to the squatter gave her a higher social standing, and the fact that Mrs. Black had, sort of liked her, and therefore taken her into service, sort of makes evident that there are notions of marrying English girls were still strong at this time, and that it was also a strong connection to the homeland, okay, in that many people in Australia at the time still saw themselves as English but living somewhere else. And even though Lawson is evidently a nationalist and very happy to constantly talk about notions of, as an Australian, which is referenced quite frequently here, still has very strong connections to the Englishness of this nation that he's in part building. In stark contrast, Jack, who is Joe's best friend, and Joe does not pick him up on it or even flinch or is not the least bit uncomfortable with the comment, quote, "I saw the half-caste cook tidying up your room." Later in the text, Jack also says, quote, "that damn slut of a half-caste cook," unquote. Now, both are highly visual and extremely racist, but at the time were considered acceptable. And that runs right through this text. So Joe Wilson's Courtship gives us a real understanding of society at the time and the values of society at the time and how that society was structured. Just as a side comment, this is actually an image of a photographic image of Indigenous workers on a station about 200 kilometres from Bourke. Early 1900s. Now, the relationship between Joe and between Mary grows, and over time he actually offers to lend her some money. She stands up very upset and goes back inside the house and refuses his offer. The quote here, "We watch the moon rise and I'll lend you the money," etc. here, is very romantic, but it also establishes the social distance between individuals at the time, particularly between the genders. The flashback establishes that Mary is very much interested in Joe, and Joe is a bit awkward, and then through some vernacular phrases we get the idea that, the Sydney Jackaroo and comes onto the scene, and that Joe mooched, which is a connotative verb, like an orphaned bandicoot, which is a simile, in that he becomes very jealous because Mary shows the Jackaroo some attention, and the Jackaroo shows Mary some attention. We understand from the narration that the station has a lot of people working at it, including a lot of men, and there is quite a considerable amount of social interaction. Mind you, it's polite social interaction. But the quote that Joe becomes crankier than a wall-eyed bullock with the pleuro indicates that there is some level of anxiousness on Joe's part about the relationship. And it also builds up that Mary was actually worth pursuing. I've just got a picture here of a bullock for you to sort of get an idea of what they actually look like. There are many awkward moments as well. One being when Joe tries to help um, Mary when the clothesline breaks, and he by accident offers to put out to hang up the underwear for her after he's helped fix the line, and of course she snatches the basket away from him, and he misinterprets it, but it's the visual is created by the verbs in this particular case. And of course, this narrative complication raises the tension of the romance. Again, we have this, sort of little snapshots of station life with men sitting around having a smoke, and they're talking about the social life that they're going to have. So they're going to have a party for the anniversary night. Anniversary Day was celebrated, was the celebration of first settlement, what we would call Australia Day. While there have been many tensions in the relationship between Joe and Mary, be they petty jealousies or awkward moments, Romany rides into Havland, and Joe accidentally causes Romany to fall off his horse with a wire that's strung out for Mary's washing, and he embarrasses the bushman. Again, the values of white Australia come out. In the description of him, he was a big shearer, dark and handsome fellow who looked like a gypsy. He reckoned there was a bit of foreign blood in him. This is not meant, as a compliment, but it does give us an insight into the values at the time, however uncomfortable they may make us in the 21st century as Australians. Romany, who's rather out of sorts having been knocked off his horse, slights Mary's singing with the idiomatic phrase that he's heard a tomcat sing better. Now, it is likely that he's trying to wind Joe up, and it works. Again, dialogue is used with idiomatic phraseology that is highly visual in the idea that she would set her cap at anybody and run after anyone with trousers on, which is really making out that Mary is, for want of a better word, a loose woman or has lost her virtue. And of course, this is said amongst the men, not to her. And so you get this idea of men and yarns, and of course, Joe has to stand up for her. Joe, of course, can't contain his anger, and so he rises to the occasion, and a fight is organised. And the fight will be held in the quiet little moonlight flat by the river, which is quite a beautiful depiction for such a violent event. The fight scene, of course, is rather visually active. It's the verbs that make that do it, and also some of the figurative language. For example, the simile, they said we went like windmills. So you can imagine their hands moving rather rapidly, but not a lot of skill and not a lot of punches actually landing. And then there's this comment that there's nothing like a fight to teach a man. So it's got that idea that manhood and fighting, so images of manhood, are defined by their ability to stand up and be counted. Of course, Jack, Joe's friend, is terribly pleased that, he's managed to have this fight and to defend the virtue of Mary. The fact that Jack is fairly badly injured is not so much of the concern. The simile here, that he was as proud as a dog with a tin tail as he fussed, gives us insight into the values. The idea that it was important for men to stand up and to defend their property or their family. Having seen the tenacity of Joe, we then get to see the tenacity of Mary. She accidentally almost kills Jack, having taken the gun from the kitchen in a brave attempt to kill a hawk that has been killing chickens. So she's brave and defending the house and, the livelihood. You can make a connection here to the drover's wife as well. I want to make the point here with the quote that's here that the present tense is used to give real immediacy so that when you're reading the scenes, you can see the scenes because of the tense. Jack, of course, advises Joe to go down by the river flat sometime tonight after the anniversary dance, and we'll send her down towards you. And so Joe waits for Mary, and here we've got this, the shadow and the peppermint trees and the moonlight. So you've got this rather romantic visual happening. Joe Wilson's Courtship has quite a lot of romantic imagery, and the positional language actually establishes a snapshot. And there's a sense of being settled with to nature, which is not found in some of the other texts. So you've got this horseshoe of high blue hills rounded beneath the house, running river under the slopes, and a rounded hill covered with pines, soft blue peaks away in the distance. So it's here that he waits for Mary. And we wait with him, looking at the same image. And so Mary arrives, and we have this very lovely romantic sort of in the dark, in the moonlight, and Mary talks of terrible dreams, and so she shares her fears. And you can make a link here to the drover's wife. Again, there are fears held by women. And she's fearing Romany, but Joe takes her into his arm, and Mary resists. Again, we've got this social circumstance. She resists and says, I can't kiss you because I can't kiss someone I haven't married. And so, of course, Joe proposes. Mary, of course, can't marry without permission from somebody, and that somebody will have to be male. This gives us insight to the values at the time. And so it's to Black, to Mr. Black, the squatter, that Joe goes to find. And so the visual, again, of the squatter sitting with other men that work and other bushmen that work is again depicted. Very quickly, it's a snapshot, but it's one that shows Lawson's view of social circumstance. In other stories, he's highly critical of those people who are in the city, or those people who have wealth, but he doesn't actually have those views when it comes to the wealthy within the farming communities. Again, it's dialogue that establishes the conversation. So we've got Joe, I want little Mary, and of course Black then starts with the thing was he's quiet, and he says, oh, I just got to thinking of the days when I was courting Mrs. Black. And so again it reinforces the importance of romance and of courting in supporting the difficulties that come with a married life. And here the difficulties are related to the difficult climate, the isolation and the loneliness of the bush. And so this is where the unity comes for Lawson, for those people who may come from a different social class, but because they share the same difficulties or the same arduous climate, and remember that Lawson found the climate to be quite difficult and malevolent, almost evil, that this is where that unity comes from. Of course, as a framing device, this is how the story began, with an old man telling young men about their courting days and the importance of it. And here we have an old man Black telling young Joe that he got to think about his courting days, but he doesn't give him any advice. This photo has nothing to do with the actual story, but it is actually a photo of a working man and working woman's sort of photograph of their marriage, and I thought I'd just include that. And by contrast, I'll include the next photo, which is of a squatter and his wife at about the same time, early 1900s. So here's the lovely photo of the squatter. I'd just like to acknowledge the community of Burke, who've given me quite a lot of photographs and access to a lot of photographs that I've used in this presentation. Burke is in New South Wales. It is one of the towns that Henry Lawson visited, and his trip is actually depicted in our next short story, In a Dry Season,